So we're going to get started, and I'm really pleased to have Jonathan Moreno here. He's traveled from Pennsylvania. We emphatically encourage you to purchase his books. He'll be doing a book signing afterwards by getting books sold. It's a great way for us to get important authors to make their way here. How many of you have never been here before? A lot? Okay, great. We've been doing this for about a year and a half. The group was founded about 4 years ago, then it was dormant for about a year. The founder had his company, which was something like Dropbox, it was called Drop.io, purchased by Facebook, and he's a really high-up senior executive there. And we're pleased that he set the foundation for this. And I took it over about a year ago. I wanted to still have some tech topics, but to expand the range of the future outlook, which could be 10 years out. It used to be 30 years. We found it's just very hard to get people to talk about 30 or 40 years out. For whatever reason, they don't think that far, or it's just they don't want to commit themselves. So our agenda is, we'll do a book giveaway very shortly, based on everyone who left a business card. But we do encourage you to buy any of Jonathan's books that are on sale through Book Court, right back in front, back table over there. We'll have a 10-minute futurist briefing by our sponsor, Gray Scott, with Serious Wonder. He has some really interesting articles and concepts to talk about. And then we'll go right into Jonathan's talk. He'll do a book signing at the end, and we encourage you to stick around to just chat with each other to the extent you want. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gray, and he will tell you what he's working on these days.
Great. Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to thank Mike for having me and for organizing this event. So my name is Gray Scott. I'm the founder and futurist at Serious Wonder. I think some of you saw the flyers that I gave out. I'm a techno-philosopher, so I don't know how many of you in here self-identify as futurists. Can I see a show of hands of how many actually are futurists in the room? So, yeah, or call yourself futurists? So I'm actually a techno-philosopher, which is a growing field that we're promoting on our site and we're really excited about. I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about a couple of concepts that we've been covering on Serious Wonder that I think some of you might find frightening and some of you might find fascinating. And I'm open for you guys sending emails to Serious Wonder. I would love to hear your feedback on some of the concepts, whether you have some input or how you feel about these things. So there's several ideas. I want to talk to you briefly about 3 fascinating futurist ideas that really will change the world forever as we know it. The quest for extreme life extension is the first one. The second one is space-time crunch, and the third one is urban efficiency. And I'm going to go through those 3 in this talk. These are 3 different articles that we've covered on Serious Wonder, and the first one was the concept written by our senior editor, Nicole Canavero, and it was about a story about, believe it or not, it was about a head transplant. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. So an Italian neuroscientist, Dr. Sergio Canavero of the University of Turin, believes that he has figured out how to literally transplant a head. And the way that he's thinking that he will do this is actually take the head and the spine and sever the spinal cord, freeze down to 18 degrees Celsius with a clean, ultra-sharp blade, we hope it's an ultra-sharp blade, that would leave 2 severed spinal cords suitable for reattachment. Now this is a fascinating idea because, first of all, as we move further and further, I'm sure you guys have heard of 3D printing, yes? How many of you heard? Okay. So there are lots of things happening in 3D printing right now, especially bioprinting, printing hearts, printing kidneys, printing those types of organs. So the more that we move towards advancements in 3D printing, the more we're going to see this become a reality, where you can literally have your head and your spine transplanted onto a new body. This opens up a whole can of worms when we talk about implications into the future. What does it mean for someone to be paralyzed and then have a new body attached to their head and their spine? So I'm interested to hear what you guys think about this. I'm sure some of you are frightened by this, and I'm sure it maybe is exciting to some of you. But we actually found it at Serious Wonder, we thought it was very fascinating because it just opens up a whole set of ideas. The second one is this, this idea of the space-time crunch. Recently, I went to the GF 2045, which was held here in New York. And the GF 2045 conference was really a conference dedicated to finding a solution to aging and immortality, or extreme life extension. And I was privileged to see the futurologist James Martin, who actually passed away a couple of weeks ago, speak at the GF 2045 conference. And Dr. Martin actually talked about what he's been calling the crunch. Now, I've actually been calling it a space-time crunch, and I want to explain what I mean by this. I actually believe that we're experiencing a space-time crunch because as information is moving faster, and we all know that it is, we need to move faster. Our bodies, our literal bodies need to move faster through space and through space-time. So as human consciousness evolves, and as information moves faster and faster, we are literally, and as our consciousness evolves, we are literally going to need to move faster. So one solution to this space-time crunch is being offered up by Elon Musk, who I'm sure you guys know, he's the CEO of Tesla Motors, and he's offering up something called the evacuated tube transport, also known as Hyperloop transportation. Now this Hyperloop transportation, this system, has been proposed by Elon Musk, and it's basically comprised of a vacuum tube system with a magnetic levitation system similar to high-speed trains, bullet trains. Each tube would carry individual capsules with up to 6 people in each capsule, and you could literally get from New York to LA in 45 minutes. That is a time, space, or a space-time crunch, and that is where we're moving. If we ever hope to get to Mars, we're going to face a space-time crunch. You could also get from New York to China in under 2 hours. So imagine traveling through space that fast. But the fact is, we will need to move faster in the future. And finally, the third concept is urban efficiency, which affects all of us because we live in urban areas. I hope most of you live in the city. And I think Mike sort of covered this, and I think this is an interesting thing. By 2025, we will see several major cities around the world begin converting to solar power. Sounds insane now, but I'm betting you that that's going to happen. In fact, AT&T has just partnered with Goal Zero, a Brooklyn design studio called Pensa, and they've rolled out what's called Street Charge. Have you guys heard about this? So you're going to have charging stations. There's solar charging stations for your devices in the city. This is not the only thing that's happened. Mike actually covered what's being called a hybrid fiber optic system, which will allow this underground park to exist. Because what's happening is they're collecting the sunshine, running it through fiber optic cables into the underground system or inside spaces like we're in right now. So it's also called solar harvesting, which I think we're going to use a lot more of. So the fiber optic cables move into the interiors of buildings so that you're actually gathering sunshine from outside and using that natural light to light interior spaces. Now I want you to just think about this for a second. If you guys just look outside for 1 minute, you can see that there's a lot of ambient light that's going on out there. I mean, it's getting dark, but there's still some light in there. And yet we're only 10 feet from that door and we're sitting under unnatural lighting. It's energy that's being wasted. Why are we building this way? Why are we living this way? So I was asked earlier, and I just want to finish up on this concept, this idea. I was asked earlier from someone about climate change. We won't solve climate change by building the way that we've built in the past. We have to build efficiently. We have to use our knowledge, our evolution and our past to build more efficient ways of building in the cities. We're going to have to scrub the environment. We're going to have to be more efficient. And I think what you're going to see in the near future, and we've written a lot about this on Serious Wonder, we are going to see cities become hubs of energy so that you may see a reverse. Instead of energy flowing from outside the city to the inside of the city, you're going to see the cities be the places that actually bring the energy in and send it out into other places. So I invite you guys to log on to Serious Wonder, become members, give us your feedback. I would love to hear what you think about some of these concepts. I'm sure a lot of you have your own perspectives and ideas, but I am welcome to hearing anything that you guys have to say. Great. Thank you.
All right, a short introduction to Jonathan. He's the author of Mind Wars, which explores DARPA and the role of the intelligence community and university science departments in preparing the military and intelligence services for the 21st century. Super soldiers, drugs that erase fear and the need to sleep, neuroscience, advanced prosthetics, and other initiatives are changing the course of modern warfare with many ethical concerns. The scope of what's been tried is fascinating, and as well as failed, and what's being contemplated, which Jonathan is going to fill us in on. As with many tech breakthroughs, the public conversation about the consequences is often behind the pace of advancement. Jonathan is also the author of The Body Politic, The Battle Over Science in America, Is There an Ethicist in the House?, Undue Risk, State Secret Science Experiments on Humans, and Deciding Together, Bioethics and Moral Consensus. His website is jonathanmoreno.com, and please welcome Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks. So it's great to be here. I guess there's not much going on in Brooklyn tonight. This is not Occupy Brooklyn, by the way, just to clarify that, those of you who are misled. So I am a professor at Penn in medical ethics and history of science. I'm a philosopher by training, but the more I age, the more interested I am in the past, because I'm living a lot more of my life in the past than I am in the future, I think, in some timeless sense. So a lot of what I do is history of science, and a number of years ago I became interested in what was going on in neuroscience, both from a history point of view, as well as from a somewhat, I would say, futurist standpoint with a small f. I do want to thank very much Mike for making this possible, and the Futurist Society, and to Gray for the goodies. And that was a very appropriate introductory talk, I thought, because especially the head transplant, is it a head transplant or a body transplant? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not so sure. Yeah, kind of a terminological problem. In bioethics, we've actually been talking about this kind of thing for a while. My problem is that how could I find a better body, you know? What's so funny about that? So, where was I? So let me, William James was my favorite philosopher. He used to say that life is a series of interruptions. But we tend to interrupt ourselves, or at least I certainly do. So, timeliness is where I'll start with the talk. Of course, as we know, President Obama has decided to, in some sense, allocate $100 million for a brain project, misreported, by the way, in the New York Times by a writer who's otherwise pretty good, Markov. He kind of implied that it was a human brain project, but it's not. They're actually starting with zebrafish, so they got a ways to go. But in Europe, the European Union has funded to the tune of about $2 billion in theory a human brain project, the HBP, and so they're much more audacious than the audacious President Obama with respect to the brain, it seems. Full disclosure, I work 1 day a week for the President's Bioethics Commission, which has the job of doing the bioethics piece of the brain project, so we are going to be publishing a report. This is an unintelligible, this is a simplified version of the White House produced to explain what the Brain Initiative is, which maybe they need some more communications people up there. But if you look at this on the web, you will see that it is a public-private partnership project, and there's mention of the fact that the Bioethics Commission is going to be doing a report on the ethical issues in neuroscience. So. Neuroscience, obviously, as my colleague Martha Farrar at Penn says, the brain is hot. huge growth in the field of neuroscience. The Society for Neuroscience probably is competing now with the cardiology meetings as one of the biggest science meetings in the world. They've got 40,000 people at the Society for Neuroscience. This growth is measurable in a lot of ways. A lot of it has to do with the fact that there is new neuroimaging. I'm going to talk about that briefly tonight. That's out of the early 90s, and there's a lot of money, frankly, behind neuroscience. And that is part of the story as well, I'd say. So this is just a sense of publication rates, of science papers, and so forth. At Penn, my colleagues run the Neuroscience Boot Camp, which is really popular. You can hardly get into that thing. It's amazing. Over the summer, there are debates about neuroscience in the legal setting. I'll mention some of that, but I'm going to focus really on the national security stuff. So this is these numbers are a couple of years old now, but it hasn't changed all that much, except that the DARPA's budget has been cut, interestingly. This is from a colleague at Georgia Tech who figured this out, Margaret Kosel. This is just cognitive neuroscience funding. This is not a sort of hardwiring connectionist stuff. And cognitive neuroscience, for various reasons, I think, is mainly where the national security establishment is interested, because they're interested in behavior and perception. So this is real money. More than Penn pays me a year. To say that. DARPA stands, as you probably know, for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is not a spy agency; it's a science agency. Their funding is about $3 billion, which is nothing, actually, in the scheme of things. And they've cut about $130 million, as I recall, actually. But they're still at it, and they are sponsoring a lot of neuroscience-related projects. If you go to the DARPA website, you can read about them. It's hard to know how much of DARPA is public, but my guess is that most of DARPA's projects are not classified. And you can learn a lot about what DARPA is interested in neuroscience from just going to their website. There has been a discernible 9/11 effect in neuroscience, and this is true in science in general, by the way. But I had a student intern just put in brain research, neuroscience, and national security, counterintelligence, et cetera, et cetera. I can't remember what the combinations were. It's in the book. But basically, you can see that from around 2001 up to roughly the present, there's been this kind of effect of more papers published in the general area of neuroscience and national security, or counterintelligence, mind reading, and so forth. It's not surprising. Some of you are probably in universities. I know a lot of my colleagues have proposals on their hard drives that didn't get funded. And when there's a new request for proposals that comes out of an agency, they look at they figure out what the keyword is supposed to be, and they pop in the keyword, and now they're qualified to apply for this grant. So this is the way things happen, and there's a gradual trailing off, which is natural also, to be expected, as the data gets absorbed by the rest of the funded system. So these are some of the topics that I write about in Mind Wars that I'm going to talk about tonight. But when people ask me, sort of, what are you talking about when you refer to the brain and national security? For those of you who are not of a certain age, I'm just going to play a little of this for you. This is from The Manchurian Candidate, the original one.
Captain, our Major Bennett Marco have been reassigned to Army intelligence in Washington.
This broadcast not go back to public view.
Except for one thing. Night after night, the Major was plagued by the same recurring nightmare.
Yeah. He just kind of washed up until it.
Yeah. 62.
Another modern discovery, which we owe to the hydrangea, concerns the influence of air drainage upon plant life. Many years ago, when I was traveling about the country, I noticed magnificent hydrangeas on the hills, where the air drainage can brain simulate to lower levels gives the gills a decided advantage. Thus it was the hydrangeas that gave the first pointer in another modern discovery of horticultural importance. From this, it might appear that the hydrangea is a very simple plant, but there are more complications. The cultivation of hydrangeas was evolved from a number of varieties originally found in Japan, not all of which, of course, have the same characteristics. Two of them do not share the quality of producing blue flowers in mineral-rich soils.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners that I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word. To believe that they are waiting on a storm, lobbying a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club has been broken.
You will notice that I have told them they may smoke. I've allowed my people to have a little fun in the selection of bizarre tobacco substitutes.
So you get the general idea. The Manchurian Candidate was a cultural expression of the concern that people had in the early 50s that our men who were prisoners of war in North Korea, who signed false confessions and said treasonous things, that they were somehow turned in a special way, some secret Oriental, as the word was used in those days, formula that we didn't understand. There was also worry that perhaps they were using hallucinogens to do that, a kind of allusion to that in the last remark, and maybe LSD. I've written about LSD experiments elsewhere, and they're sort of part of this cultural history. But this is a way that many people at first became concerned in this country that somehow new ways of managing the brain could be turned against us and became a real national security concern. Many of you know that there was a project run by the CIA called MKUltra, and before that, projects, code word, were Artichoke and Bluebird, in which hallucinogens were used because John Foster Dulles was very worried about what they might be doing to us. Some of this came out in the mid-1970s in the Church Committee hearings. This is basically all of the MKUltra activities engaged in by the agency during the 50s were blotted out of the historical ledger because the documents were sanitized. But they did seem to forget the accounting documents. So when Senator Church went back in the mid-70s to look to see what could be learned about MKUltra, they found this document. I know you can't really see too well, most of you, but it was a top secret, it was formally top secret. Don't worry, it's been declassified. You're not going to Guantanamo because I'm sure it is. But this is a June 1953 memo from Sidney Gottlieb, who was the CIA's sort of Q, those of you who were James Bond fans. And this indicates that $39,500 would be used on LSD experiments, LSD antagonists, and so forth. Again, coming out of concerns about what was happening to our people in North Korea. Now, some of you have probably seen this. A lot of my students have at Penn, but I'm going to show it to you anyway, and you'll get the idea.
The drug was administered in a drink of water given at the start of each day's exercise. 25 minutes later, the first effects of the drug became apparent. The men began to relax and to giggle. But this man was more seriously affected and had to be removed from the exercise. After 35 minutes, one of the radio operators had become incapable of using his set, and the efficiency of the rocket launcher team was also very impaired. 10 minutes later, the attacking section had lost all sense of urgency. Notice the bunching and indecision as they enter a wood occupied by the enemy. Almost immediately, the section commander tried to use a map to find the location of troop headquarters, and the prisoner's escort had to have the way pointed out to him, although it was in plain sight 700 yards away over open country. 50 minutes after taking the drug, radio communication had become difficult, if not impossible, but the men are still capable of sustained physical effort. However, constructive action was still attempted by those retaining a sense of responsibility in spite of physical symptoms. that 1 hour and 10 minutes after taking the drug, with one man climbing a tree to feed the birds, the team commander gave up, admitting that he could no longer control himself or his men. He himself then relaxed into laughter.
Let it never be said that I go for the cheap laughs. So this is a real film of an actual exercise in the early 60s. I love the cut glass Oxford accent narrative. It helps a lot. This is a project that was probably done with cooperation of the United States and Canada. There was a lot of work being done at Portondown in the UK that had to do with biological and chemical weapons from the early 50s at least through the mid 60s. And this was an LSD-related, hallucinogen at least related study. The film actually is in the Imperial War College, and my colleagues over there don't really know how it got on YouTube, but it did. There are other segments of video from this exercise, one of which I've seen, that is not nearly as funny. The one fellow who was taken off the field because he was so disturbed is seen in this other 2-minute excerpt, walking around among some other guys in uniform saying, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. So he had a psychotic episode as a result of participation in this field exercise. There were 2 concerns in general the intelligence community had. One was that you could use an hallucinogen as kind of a truth serum, so that you could take somebody with a physicist with a high security clearance who had a meeting, and afterwards you go out for drinks in Paris or somewhere, and then they stick something in his drink, maybe it's LSD or something else, and in the words that they used in the 50s, make a discreet man indiscreet. Turns out that the best way to do that is really sex and alcohol, but we didn't really appreciate that apparently in the 1950s. But this has to do more with getting something into a water supply or aerosolizing it. Also very ineffective. Anybody who knows about chemical weapons knows that that doesn't work too well because of sunlight and wind and so forth. Nonetheless, these things were done. They were part of the era. And I'm going to read this to you because now I'm going to jump ahead to the late 80s. This is from the National Research Council. I've been on a bunch of National Academies committees. And I just love to read this to you because I love to read something like this to people. There's a concern in this committee about the mind race, the claimed phenomenon applications presented by several military officers range from the incredible to the outrageously incredible. The anti-missile time warp, for example, is somehow supposed to deflect attack from nuclear warheads so that they will transcend time and explode among the ancient dinosaurs. Now, time out. I told Ray before that I was a charter subscriber to the Science Fiction Book Club, and I know that if you go back in time and kill something, that when you come back, everything will be different, right? It's the butterfly wing theory. So, I don't know, they obviously didn't read Philip K. Dick. But it goes on. One suggested application is a conception of the 1st Earth Battalion made up of warrior monks, including the use of ESP, leaving their bodies at will, levitating, psychic healing, and walking through walls. Now, I'm not making this up. You can go on the National Academy's press website and read this report. This is not so long ago. This is 1988. You will be perhaps relieved to know that the scientists on this committee advised the Army that probably this was not the best use of resources. Although I've heard people say that they are not so sure this really ended as a result of this National Research Council report. So there's some of you have probably seen the film, Staring at Goats, and this is the warrior monks, inspired by that report. Okay, now, Scotty.
It's something cylindrical. It's a pencil.
Okay, Larry.
This is Larry's spirit guide, Maud. I'm looking into the cupboard now, and I see a tin mug.
Lynn.
It's a man sitting in a chair.
No, wait a minute. You said A, not K? You said A.
Bravo Zulu, well, outstanding.
So, I've been going through this history because I want to make the point that we've been interested in the brain and questions of international military competitiveness for a very long time. This is not new. And I think we get a lot of the, next to the rest of the talk is sort of about some of the razzle-dazzle devices, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is not entirely new. There is a process here. I could have actually started, for example, in World War I, the British Army jazzed up the relatively recently developed Binet test for intelligence, now called the Stanford Binet because Stanford University professors worked on it after Binet developed it, and the British would rather arbitrarily assign to the infantry the people who scored the lowest on the Stanford Binet IQ test. And that turned out to be a very big mistake. Because in the infantry, the combat units, you actually want a range of personalities and emotional intelligence, we would today call it, lots of different kinds of people. So that was a mistake, and they figured that out. Now, I could have talked about, as I am going to about now, the Second World War, when the thematic apperception test and other personality assessments were used. So this is the period, sort of pre-fancy device-oriented neuroscience. People were very interested in these questions because, in a certain sense, the mind is the battlefield. So today we've kind of gone into what some of my colleagues call drugs, bugs, and slugs. First, the drugs. Some of you probably know that there's a company outside Philadelphia called Cephalon that has made a great deal of money with a medication called modafinil, which is prescribed for people who have sleep disorders. That's how the FDA approved it, but it's being used now by all sorts of people who have to, for various reasons, stay awake. Shift workers, long-haul truck drivers. One of my colleagues at Penn says that his prescription for his colleagues who are going to, say, China to deliver a paper and then have to come back in 2 days is Ambien when you get on the plane and modafinil when you get off the plane. So if you're a responder, this has turned out to be very effective, up to 60, 70, 80 hours. The NIMH has found without any measurable decrement in concentration and attention. I think it's probably not a good idea to take modafinil habitually because we do need to sleep. I'm not exactly sure why we need to sleep, but we do need to sleep. We consolidate things when we sleep and so forth. But it is certainly being used by Air Force pilots along with speed. The history of cognitive enhancement, as we today call it, is also an interesting subchapter of this talk. Actually, we're not very good at cognitive enhancement. The best thing you can do is get a good night's sleep, eat well. Those are the best enhancers, really, for cognition in general. Caffeine. Obviously, military is big on caffeine, nicotine. And before that, there were experiments with cocaine. Prussian Army tried cocaine, like everybody else, in the late 19th century. But really, we're not very good at cognitive enhancement. This is one that does seem to have some merit in the sense that it does seem to be able to help you stay awake and alert for longer than most people can. Also, the drugs category is oxytocin, which anybody who has given birth or has been with somebody who's given birth might know a version of oxytocin is given called pitocin to help labor and delivery. Oxytocin, as you may have heard of this, is also sometimes called a cuddle drug because supposedly after an intimate affair you make a lot of oxytocin. But we actually make the oxytocin for various things. It's one of those brain hormones that does a lot in our heads. And even when we're having a nice conversation with somebody, we're probably making a good amount of oxytocin. So one question is whether you could actually introduce oxytocin artificially, say through the nasal route, and enhance people's trust, so that the next person who comes in the room would be, the good cop. Now, there have been some experiments with oxytocin. There's a guy at the Claremont Graduate School who's named Paul Zak, who's actually an economist. And Paul had the idea about a dozen years ago to see if you could actually find some people who would give other people oxytocin. And he developed this stuff that pops it up into your nostrils. And there were some experiments, there have been some experiments in Switzerland, basically gaming experiments. They gave people oxytocin, put them into a competitive gaming environment. And it turns out they are a little more cooperative, a little more trusting, according in these very strictly controlled studies, once they've been given a little extra oxytocin. Now, and of course, the interesting question is, could you use this in interrogation situations? Now, people's intuitions about this, I think, are very interesting, because when I said, well, would this be better than waterboarding, physical torture? First of all, probably it doesn't work. But anyway, putting that aside for the moment, would it be better than physical torture? Many people say, well, yeah, it's better because you don't feel pain. On the other hand, I think philosophically you could say, well, gee, you're really reaching into something pretty deep we value the ability to decide to whom to disclose things. You know, it's part of our sense of privacy, which is under attack, I know, in various ways right now. So maybe this is pretty, this raises big philosophical policy questions. In any case, it's an abstract question, because this would probably be illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention. So we can talk more about that if you like. I'll mention that again. Now, also we have all these different ways of doing it. Brain imaging, getting into the devices now. Functional MRI is the big one, but there's also PET and functional near-infrared spectroscopy. Now, how many of you are familiar with this experiment that Jack Allen did at Berkeley? You've seen this. So when Jack talks about this, he always says, gee, this is a little scary even to me. So basically what happens is somebody's in the functional or in the big magnet, they're looking at the video on the left, and then based on the data that Gallant and his team are getting, with 6 million images that they've got and a really fast computer, they're reconstructing the image. So there's a whole bunch of algorithms and fast computing involved in this experiment. And you can say, well, it's pretty fuzzy, but you know, it's getting to something. So I know Carol Browner, and when I sent her an email, she used to be EPA, and I said, Carol, you're in a mind reading experiment. And she said, Jonathan, you have to explain how you work what this is about. So this is you can see it's pretty fuzzy. You can look at it again. Although you can find this stuff. Apparently Gallant is now working on the sequel to this experiment. I think I mentioned he had 6 million images, and now he's got something like 26 million images in his database. So presumably the more images you have in the database, and the better the data that you're getting from the imaging device, the better your algorithms get, the more clear, the more precise these can be. Now, again, you're not actually seeing what's going on in somebody's head. Right? This is a reconstruction based on a whole bunch of data. I said to my students that I was having a seminar at Penn in technology studies about a year and a half ago, and I said, well, this is pretty impressive as a, kind of a carnival barker, sort of sense of impressive. It's entertaining, it's fascinating. But the visual cortex is really big, and we know a lot about it. So to the neuroscience world, this is kind of low-hanging fruit. It's almost cheating. So I said, there's none of our other sensory apparatus that we've been able to reconstruct like this. Of course, what happens these days, and this is sort of Craig's point, things are moving so fast that if you say something in class 1 week, 2 weeks later, you could be proven wrong. And it was about 2 weeks after I said that to my class that this article was published. So the setup is this. And this is also Berkeley people. I don't know what's going on out there. The Berkeley team, not Gallant's team. So what these people have done is they've had people on basically open brain surgery for the placement of deep brain stimulation electrodes for the treatment of Parkinson's symptoms. And they've also agreed, informed consent, to have some other devices placed that would indicate what cells are firing when they hear a certain word. And then based on what cells are firing when they hear that word, the team, again, goes through an elaborate reconstruction process. So what you're going to hear first in this audio file is the word that somebody is saying while the patient is, and this local anesthesia, this is how it's done, you're basically awake during home skull surgery. While the word that they're hearing, and then the reconstruction of the word with using 2 different algorithms and devices that I don't understand. But let's see what you think.
Walter,
structure,
Town. Doubt.
concrete, pencil,
So, kind of impressive. I mean, it's not perfect, but you can imagine again that it will get less fuzzy as this group keeps doing these experiments. Now, other experiments are probably going to be harder. There's a whole different system, for example, for smell, as you probably know. That's really old. It's like reptilian. So try to remember what a mushroom tastes like, for example. That's maybe a little harder to do that. Nonetheless, I wouldn't sell the neuroscientist short. So this is the Brooklyn now part of the story. So how many of you remember the Robo-Rat? So I taught it downstate for 8 years, from 88 to 96. And I'm a philosopher. I started the medical ethics program at downstate. But of course, it's basically one big building. And I used to walk past the labs of my colleagues, and it was fascinating to me because I thought, this is great. These are the people who actually bring rats to Brooklyn. So in that spirit, it turned out that while I was there, I didn't know, there was a study going on that was just starting. Actually it was a DARPA-sponsored study that has been popularly called the Robo-Rat, and here's a little clip that explains what they were doing.
Dr. John Chapin has been exploring the minds of rats for more than 20 years. The culmination of all this research is a unique interface between animal and machine.
You see this all the time.
A remote controlled rat.
What we've been doing is actually guiding him wirelessly by sending signals from a laptop computer to his brain. And we also have a camera on his backpack so that you can see the world from the way the rats see it.
Chapin has gained control over the rat's decisions by tapping directly into its brain. A radio signal from the computer stimulates the brain areas that are connected to the whiskers. When they stimulate the left whisker, the rat turns left. Stimulate the right, the rat turns right. It does have a choice, but if it does as asked, the rat is rewarded with a hit to the pleasure center of the brain.
He needs to get some walking. He needs to lose some weight. Hey, you need to be doing aerobics, guy.
So you get the general idea. Why would DARPA be interested in how to control rats? Well, you can imagine, since we know rats are basically all cartilage. If a rat's, urban dwellers know this very well, if you have a hole in your baseboard about this big, a full-grown rat can squeeze its way through into your house. In the event of a building collapse, for example, it could be very useful to have a rat be able to scuttle into that building with a light and with a camera to see if anybody survived. Maybe a mine clearing operation, we blow up some rats to clear some mines in the field, that's okay. A TV news producer from Japan actually visited Chapin's lab. He didn't do this particular film, he did another one. And he told me that there was also a robo-primate that they would not allow the Japanese crew to film. So what Chapin is really interested in is not making living things into robots. What he's really interested in is understanding how the brain works. And you do that partly by understanding how the pathways interact and intersect and operate in certain behaviors. So that's sort of looking inside the brain and managing the brain. There's also a movement, folks who are interested in external neuromodulation using very modest electrical signals. Some of you probably know about transcranial magnetic stimulation. There is actually a DIY TMS group. There's a guy who blogs. He zaps himself, and then he blogs about how he's done better doing Sudoku or something. These devices have been around since the mid-'80s. Actually, TMS, or transcranial direct current stimulation, which is another version of essentially similar technology, is approved for use with people who have depression that is refractory to medication. Some people I've talked to in psych at Penn believe that this will actually replace ECT because it doesn't cause seizures. But we haven't quite gotten to that point in the change of standards yet. We also know that you can change attitudes and perceptions, and there are, again, people who believe that you can actually help people learn faster with certain kind of electromagnetic pulses. This morning I was on a panel at the AAAS in Washington where a chemist was talking about some of the work that he's doing with stress hormones. And so there's some indication that TMS can also be used to downregulate stress hormones. Very interesting work, and obviously has some very interesting implications in the world of combat. And this is just a screen grab of the DIY transcranial recurrent stimulation blogger that I was telling you about. You're going to hear a lot about this new technology that comes out of Stanford called optogenetics, and it's described on the slide. This is a technology that it will enable us not only to see what of several neurons are firing, but maybe hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of neurons, how they're interconnected with each other, which you can't do right now. And you do that by inserting a protein that is sensitive, that is light sensitive, and then seeing where that protein goes. So a part of the President's Brain Initiative is to try to get a better understanding of how the brain's connections are set up and how they can be changed. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard about what we might be called the robo-soldier that Samsung is field testing at the demilitarized zone in Korea. I was in Seoul a few weeks ago, and it's a little weird to be 45 minutes away from the demilitarized zone, which, as somebody said to me before I went, could definitely be the militarized zone any minute. Fortunately, that did not happen. Essentially, this is a robot, and by the way, DARPA and Boston Scientific just a few weeks ago, I need to have a slide. This is a problem with this PowerPoint presentation. You can't even stay ahead of it. There's a new robot that DARPA and Boston Scientific have produced. They just unveiled it a couple of weeks ago called Atlas, which is basically its job is to carry really heavy things around. But it looks suspiciously to me like the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica, but that's another talk. But this is a part of the same sort of general world of technology. This is Samsung's ad for the robot soldier, which is called the TechLink. So, I don't know about you, but I think it'd be interesting to have one of these in my front yard. So the thing about the robot soldier is that it's a lethal weapon, but it is not autonomous. That is to say, there's still a human being in the loop. But it's only a matter of engineering to change the switch and make it an autonomous lethal weapon. Now, there are already autonomous lethal weapons on naval vessels. The Aegis missile system is one of them. If anything gets into the airspace around a vessel, the missiles automatically go up and knock it down. And as you may recall, in 1998, an Iranian passenger jet was shot down that way by the Aegis system. We're told that they've since adjusted the system in light of that incident. But that's an autonomous defensive system. There's a very lot of talk right now in the war colleges about offensive systems. And the thing about these autonomous systems is that they can make decisions instantaneously, faster than human beings can. And sometimes that can be very valuable. So, those of you, Samsung is not paying me for showing this, I want to make it clear. But think now about the possibility that and this is certainly going to happen, although I said to Gray before, I don't make predictions, and I'm not a trend person. Nonetheless, this is going to happen. We're going to be writing better and better software to run machines based on what we're learning about the brain. Right now, the artificial intelligence world, as many of you know, is essentially copying the outputs of the black box, but not copying the way that the box works. We're going to be copying the way the black box, we're going to be understanding it better. And that is going to be written into the software for these devices. So one thing that no artificial intelligence device can do is make judgments. But systems will be able to make judgments, and this TechWin is going to be able to judge on its own, if we let it, whether to shoot somebody or not. Now, this is also an ethics talk. Finally got to the ethics. I'm about to finish. Do we need some new ethical principles for this new world? There's remarkably little talk about this, actually, in my world of medical ethics. But one that's been kicked around is cognitive liberty. I'm the only one who should have access to my thoughts, or should be able to give consent for you about having access to my thoughts. The problem with the philosophical principle is, as soon as you think of one, you can think of the counterexamples. Philosophers like me live on counterexamples. So, in fact, we have less cognitive liberty than we really like to think we do. We're very good at reading faces. We've evolved that way. That's why singles bars work, and how we're often able to reproduce that way. So we probably have, in fact, less cognitive liberty than we like to think. Nonetheless, as a general principle, it seems to be important. Reversibility is another idea that people have had. Maybe we should have a principle that you should not do anything to anybody that isn't reversible. Yet, as we know, everything that happens that we perceive changes our brain. Who was the member of Congress who said that pornography changes your brain a while ago? Well, yes, it does, and so does everything else that you experience. So there are always exceptions to these principles. There's also international law. I go to a lot of international meetings, and in the rest of the world, you hear a lot about international law, and in this country, you hardly hear about it at all. But they actually do talk about it. So not only the Declaration of Helsinki and the Geneva Conventions, but also the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention actually do have some say about the things that we can do in these areas. Those of you who want to read more from the horse's mouth, as it were, really want to go deeper into this stuff, there are a couple of National Research Council reports that are, again, online, like that enhancement report that I showed you a little while ago. What I think is interesting about this, and I was on, full disclosure, I was on this committee, the client for this is the Defense Intelligence Agency, which I think tells you something about the level of interest in neuroscience. There was another group that was working, in fact, while we were working, we didn't even know that they were meeting, on Army opportunities in neuroscience, that was obviously sponsored by the Army, and these were some of the ideas that the report suggested the Army might be interested in. And I think especially interesting is in-helmet EEG, or brain-machine interface. They also mentioned in the report transcranial magnetic stimulation. Maybe if a warfighter is driving a tank and through sensors we know that he or she is getting a little tired, give them the zap. And this is stuff that actually is on-the-shelf technology that is really waiting to be tested. There's also some really stupid stuff. It was also on this committee. This is a handheld lie detector. It's based on the same crappy technology as traditional lie detector. The client for this report was the DIA and the Director Office of the Department of National Intelligence. So this is what it looks like. About a 70% accuracy rate in the hands of a really effective, a really expert person. Can tell the difference between truth and lie. Now, interesting thing about this, and this is public, we had a public meeting, a workshop meeting. It turns out that this is actually being used as one way of seeing whether locals are trustworthy for work in the Green Zone in Baghdad, which is, of course, our massive embassy complex. Why is this so popular? Somebody said to me, well, DOD really likes this because you can train a 20-year-old soldier to use this in about 3 minutes. It has 3 lights on it. What are they? Yeah, green and red and yellow. So, not too hard to interpret that. Right now, I'm serving on this committee, which is the name of this committee was obviously developed by a committee. We're going to report out this fall, and this is the work here is on sort of emerging technologies and how we can get ahead of the ethical, legal, and social issues instead of always trying to catch up, as we generally do, to the new technologies. So that's my thank you slide. Before I started hanging out with scientists when I was teaching philosophy, first of all, I never used PowerPoint. Secondly, I noticed that scientists always had a thank you slide. Usually it was a picture of their lab, you know. And philosophers never had thank you slides. Who would we thank? You know, Plato. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, this is my thank you slide, and thanks to you for coming tonight, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I guess we'll take questions.
Gee. Should I do that?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I'll hand the mic.
Are you aware of
we're going to get you on the record.
the, so right,
Everybody's
you're mentioning DARPA's work with brain implants, and are you aware of the work that they're doing with brain implants into insect larvae, and then as they grow up, then they'll be basically cyborg insect soldiers?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of work up with insects.
Right, okay. So the next question is, can you see a point where the same type of technology might be used with humans, and there are certainly some questions with that.
Yeah, we're not insects or rats, and so there was one Japanese journalist who supposedly had himself hooked up to a device, something like the one that Chapin and his team are using at Downstate. He reported, and I have to say that it was sort of a website that I can't find again, but somebody didn't want it up. But he reports sort of having feeling like his muscles were being jerked and so forth. So probably not very subtle. One would never want to say never, but we're a long way from getting to the point where you could, using devices like that, at least make people behave in certain ways, except in a very gross sense. But the insect thing is interesting because there's a concern about using swarms of tiny sort of insect robots as drones. And there's a group in Europe that is, now actually it's pretty much international, that is trying to establish the conditions for a new international convention concerning the use of drones. And one of their ideas is that no drone should be smaller than big enough to put a person in. In other words, that it should be required that drones be of a certain size, a certain dimension, because the implications of having very tiny drones are so grievous. Now, I don't know if they're going to, pardon the pun, get off the ground with that proposal, but that is one idea that's floating around. But then there are also actual biological insects that, yes, people are also using to try to send signals to get them to do things, and with some effectiveness.
So a lot of the research in previous decades that you were talking about was sort of like pseudoscience, or at least not effective. Were there any effective things that happened in previous decades, and what do you think the mix is today of stuff that's not going to be useful and stuff that may be useful?
I actually think that, so I alluded very briefly to the personality assessment stuff in the Second World War. And so I am now, God forgive me, writing yet another book that's involving that topic. And I do think that the personality assessments that were done in the World War II era and the group dynamic studies that were done and sort of left behind in the Vietnam era were useful. I was actually having a conversation with a 92-year-old retired, not surprisingly, retired general about this. This is a guy who actually started his career in the OSS, the predecessor agency to the CIA, and then was involved with paramilitary organizations in South Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. And he said to me, this is just a few days ago, that he thinks we defer too much to gadgets now and not enough to these interpersonal factors and psychological factors. So, and an example of this is the phenomenon that was called during the Vietnam War, which I'm old enough to remember this, fragging, which was when soldiers would attack their officers. What happened was that those combat units were so demoralized and hostile and frustrated. And the Defense Department no longer had the expertise, as far as I can tell, in group dynamics that they actually, the Department of War had during the Second World War. So a long-winded answer to a good question. Actually, I think that low-tech social science, social studies, group dynamics is important, and it sometimes gets eclipsed, particularly in this country, in our military culture, by a reliance on devices. So that's one example.
Get back to the front. Oh, great.
Yeah, you mentioned the Stanford domain test and so on. I wonder if you have any input into the Holland codes and the Riot-Sex stuff, interest in education, about kids understanding what their vocation should be with those kind of tests.
I don't have any expertise in that area. We should talk though afterwards. I'd be interested in hearing something about that. That doesn't mean I want to answer your question. I just want to know about it. Yeah, no, I actually have to say I don't know anything. There's I did write a little piece for this draft that I'm working on now, the new book, about Paul Torrance on the creativity metrics that he developed, which are, I gather, still being used. So but that's the limit of my knowledge of it. Sorry.
On the lie detector tests, the way I understand it, in the lie detector test, they have to get you to lie to calibrate the test, yes. Which means that, like, if you submit to a lie detector test about stealing from your company, and you think, I didn't steal from my company, so I have nothing to hide, they'll go into your sex life and every irrelevant factor of your life, looking for something that you're really embarrassed to tell.
Right, and there are lots of ways of defeating the system. I actually heard a guy who does SEER training and interrogations. SEER is survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. In an FBI committee I was serving on, say that the best you can do is 70% for lie detector, and you still have to have a somewhat cooperative subject. I didn't talk tonight about lie detection and functional MRI, and that's another big topic. I am extremely skeptical that functional MRI is resistant to the ways of defeating it that a sophisticated person can do. The other problem with all of these interrogation techniques, both low-tech and high-tech, and I'm just going to tell you something that the guy who runs what's called the high-value BTA interrogation group in the FBI said to me, and actually I said, what's the best way to avoid a successful interrogation? And he said, be stupid. Stupid people are really, really hard to interrogate. The other thing he said that was really interesting is, actually another interrogator said this to me in conversation. Many of the folks who have been used in terrorist operations, particularly people who carry suicide bombs, are mentally ill, have personality disorder of some kind. And many of them also have delusions of grandeur, of grandiloquence, and those people actually can take an intelligence officer down a long, erroneous track because they think that they're much more informed about the organization, the system than they really are, and that they're much more important than they really are. They're megalomaniacs. So be stupid and be a megalomaniac are the two best ways to avoid a successful interrogation.
You heard before about this conference that the Russians put on at Alstoy Hall.
No.
I was there also. And I must say I walked away from it with one principal reaction. This is all bullshit.
Yeah.
None of it's going to work. We have no idea how to map the brain. And we, not only do we have no idea, but we're so far away from even figuring out what the basics are. So my question is, given all the committees that you're on, given all the money that's being spent on this, is it anybody's job to debunk these ideas? Are there real experts in any of these areas who are being hired to point out how stupid all of this research is and why it won't work?
Wonderful.
There's the neuroskeptic.
There is a neuroskeptic organization. Yeah, and there are neuroskeptics, people who identify themselves as neuroskeptic. I'm a neuroskeptic in many ways. Because I I'm interested in history, and I can see how wrong we've been in so many ways. Even H.G. Wells was right about a few things that we remember him for. He was right about the rough period of the onset of World War II, but he was wrong about the Black Plague that was going to happen as a result of World War II. So, win some, you lose some. Here's the problem. And by the way, all these things that I do, I don't get paid for them. They're voluntary because I think it's so interesting. And one of my colleagues at Penn said, I'm basically an ethnographer of this world, and which I think is an accurate description. So here's the problem, ethnographically speaking. Your tax dollars are paying the national security establishment, by which I need to include military community and the national intelligence world, counterintelligence world, to keep you safe. And their view is, and you probably heard this before in various ways, that they will do whatever it takes to do that, up to the point at which the political system or received morality tells them they can't. And that includes investing in what seem to many of us to be crazy ideas. Because not all the crazy ideas turn out to be crazy. Or, if they are, they lead to something else. There's some spin-off that we hadn't thought about before. Example. On one of these committees I served on, I asked a guy who was in charge of DARPA in the late 80s if DARPA had ever thought about the cultural implications of the internet.
Yes.
And he said no. Well, he said no.
Bob Taylor was a social psychologist.
Here's the problem. There were a few people who did.
Yeah, the guy who funded it. I talked to him
But they were not, there was no systemic memory of their reflections on the prospects for this technology. In other words, there was no system within DARPA to think about the longer term questions. And there were papers. There was a guy from MIT who went to DARPA in the late 60s who wrote a famous paper in which he predicted that packet switching, which is what they were calling the transfer of data among computers between computers at that point, was going to get out of military into industry. But people didn't really think about that in a systematic way, and it wasn't part of the agency, is what I'm trying to say. And there's a lot of money involved with this. Industry is interested in this, tends to drive these things. Now, back to your point. Are there people who are skeptics? Yes, and there are people who are skeptics on these committees. You will not hear about those debates because National Research Council committees are not operated under the auspices of the Open Government Act called the Federal Advisory Committee. So they are specifically excluded so that the experts can disagree in camera, as it were. And I can tell you that there are disagreements. Now, often the disagreements tend to be based on what I'm working on. Right? So what I'm working on has promise. What you're working on is bullshit. No, they don't say it that way. But this is now. But I think in general you have to believe that some of this is going to have some spin-offs that we can't predict. And science is a community. It's a community of inquiry. Charles Peirce, the American philosopher, we're figuring out the long term here. So people exchange ideas, they do experiments, they argue about the interpretation, they argue about the interpretation of the interpretations. But we don't know what, as Gray would say, what the future holds. So given the predicate that we want to be ahead of everybody else, and that, by the way, is the express policy of the United States government since the Second World War, technological superiority. That is our mission. Not parity, superiority. So as long as that's the case, and as long as there's money, and as long as there are people who want to get their next grant, a lot of it's going to be bullshit. There's probably a better answer I could give you than that, but best I can do.
Hi. Do you think warfare needs to be fair in a certain way? So, for example, when the U.S. uses drones and it virtually runs no risk of attacking other people, that's kind of have that?
Well, there is, as you know, a very long history since St. Augustine of just war theory. Jus ad bellum refers to the rules that are supposed to govern sovereign states before they go to war. And jus in bellum refers to the rules within the war, during a war, like proportionality. So yes, I mean, the interesting thing is that, although I've never served in the armed forces, my experience is that the people who are in the armed forces have this in their DNA. Their culture, the one in which they're brought up, actually appreciates the laws of war and identifies with the laws of war, of armed conflict, as part of their code of honor. Elected officials and others, perhaps not so much. I think so. I think there are conventions that we ought to honor. Now, one of the problems is, and we've had this in this country, is that we have been, since the Second World War, almost always the first mover in a new military application. That was started with the bomb and has continued through cyber and drone and so forth. If the first mover doesn't articulate the rules and explain how what they are doing is consistent with the rules they've articulated, then you're in a very weak position to tell everybody else what to do. And this is, I think, this is not original with me, other people have said this. This is one of the problems with nuclear non-proliferation regime. We've had several opportunities, not just the Second World War, not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but other opportunities to state what the rules should be and explain how we're following the rules we've articulated, and we haven't. Now we have a problem with cyber, similar problem with drones. By the way, one of the problems with drones is a tactical problem. Are we broadening the battlefield? If the operator is in Arizona, thousands of miles away from the field of combat, or whatever it is, then have we made ourselves a legitimate target? Have we made that entity that is controlling this thing a legitimate target? Maybe people would argue we have. So even tactically, this may be unwise in the long run. So I think there are rules. I think they are recognized, if not always abided by, and we are not doing a very good job of stating the rules for the next generations of military applications of technology we're already using.
I wanted to thank you for presenting today.
Thank you.
And also I wondered what research is being done on amygdala and the soldier's fear response.
Well, so the amygdala is one of the many brain organs that is of interest. I don't know, I'd have to talk to you to see exactly what you're interested in about the amygdala, but I mentioned before the stress hormones. So that's the most concern right now is about stress hormones and how you could downregulate, both sense and downregulate stress hormones for somebody who's in a combat situation. I don't know exactly what you're referring to with respect to the amygdala. The brain, lots of the brain is recruited, as the neuroscientists say, to do lots of different things. So it's almost never a single part of the brain or one organ or one pathway that's doing what you're interested in. So people are interested in the amygdala, I'm sure in rat amygdala, in the laboratory, because there are certain very technical questions they want to answer. My guess is that they might get some money from DARPA to do something with that rat amygdala, but my guess is that in itself is not going to give us a very useful behavioral answer.
I have a question, I guess, about ethics and I guess science in general. So a lot of times when you see the technology new advances, let's say in the glass, for example, or even using KTP, etc. A lot of the public's reaction is sort of like a knee-jerk reaction to say, this should not be researched. Obviously, there's a lot of communities that talk about this. I guess what's your general opinion about that, and have you been on a committee that's, I guess, rejected unethical concerns, certain proposition, before any real research, any real science?
Right. Good, great. So are there forbidden questions? Right. And yeah, I think there are some questions that you shouldn't ask and certainly shouldn't answer. There are lots of questions about neurophysiology. There are lots of questions about the body, that if we could do live dissections, systematically, as the Japanese did in Harvey, Manchuria during World War II, we could answer. But there are some places we won't go. And I think that is quite important. I heard, this is also earlier today, I heard somebody say that the Japanese science minister a couple of administrations ago said this is the first time that the public is not only interested in what's going on in science, but also telling government what they shouldn't do with respect to science and technology. Yeah, I think there are certainly forbidden methodologies, and one that I just cited is one. Happy to talk more about that.
Well, I'd too like to thank you for your presentation. It was really everything I was looking forward to in this talk. There's
probably more laughs than I expect.
There's something I also like to touch on. It's a subject that I'm truly passionate about. And in fact, I'd like to hear your opinion on the singularity. I'd like to hear how you envision it, how, if you see a future in the military and the singularity, and that maybe you help me convince my friend Blaze here that the singularity is inevitable.
Oh, Blaze, what will we do with you? You've obviously not gotten the singularity yet. So the problem is, I go to a lot of techie conferences and so forth. When people refer to the singularity, I'm not exactly sure what they mean. And as you probably know, there are some people who think we're already there. One of my colleagues in engineering at Penn a couple of years ago spent a sabbatical at Google and told me that Google already has much more capacity than the human brain. The problem is the software isn't nearly as good. So maybe we're already there. Right? I mean, some of you have been on your devices tonight. Most of you, I imagine most of you are really on the grid much of the day. But I'm impressed that you haven't been on it, most of you, for the last hour or so. That may be already part of the singularity, what's running the system. Now, some people think that the singularity is sort of non-biological entities gone self-conscious, self-aware. That's what we mean by the singularity. There are people, you probably know some of these names, Nick Bostrom and colleagues at Oxford are working on neuroemulation, and they think that by the end of the 21st century they will be able to come up with a scheme to emulate not necessarily a human brain, but a brain in an artificial way that is in some sense self-aware. So if that's the singularity, and if Moore's law is accurate, then by the end of the 21st century at least, this group at Oxford thinks we can get there. But if you think that the singularity is what's already running, this building and PRISM and the other NSA activities, then we're already there. We've gone past it. But do you have a specific, we should talk about this, if you have a specific notion of what the singularity is, because I think there are a number of different definitions. And I'm not completely persuaded by Ray Kurzweil on this, I have to say. I mean, Moore's law works well for information technology, but it hasn't worked well for the internal combustion engine, which is still the same piece of junk that Oldsmobile was missing around the 1890s. So, a certain amount of cherry picking going on here. Yeah.
Peeking around to the history, like you say you were interested in history, I try to see where these sort of agendas were set and kind of where things branched around. And I keep going back to the Macy conferences, and just I see that as a central point. And then of course going back from there, I go back to Nazi Germany where they were doing these kind of psyop-y kind of things. And I'd ask you just if there's anything going on with the proteomics, but the Macy conference. Thanks.
Yeah, look, I mean, you can't draw an arbitrary line. Every military commander knows that you've got to convince your people that they can win. Then they're going to win. Pericles' funeral oration and so forth. There has always been lots of interest in this problem. And what I've tried to convey tonight is that we're moving into another era using different concepts to address these questions. As far as proteomics is concerned, proteomics is Well, because genomics has been done. That's so 1990s already. The Human Genome Project. There's got to be another reason to give people money to keep these labs open. So now we're interested in the way the 300,000 or so proteins work, because it's not just a gene. We thought the genes were the blueprint. No, it's not really the genes. It's the proteins. And there's probably another blueprint after the proteins. So a lot of work being done in this area. Yeah.
So we're going to do maybe 2 more questions, and then Jonathan will be available to sign this book, which we encourage you to purchase. And feel free to mingle and finish up the rest of the beverages.
Did this gentleman, did you get in at a certain point? I thought I saw your hand.
Yeah.
Maybe it was in
my hand. Yeah, I suppose I was building on the unfortunately, on the singularity question. And the idea is there are scientists like Marvin Minsky who see it as inevitable that at some point there's going to be this intersection between artificial intelligence and the human brain.
Yeah.
And the question is there any research or experiments that are happening now that are attempting to deal with that, whether it's a matter of downloading the brain onto a robot or inserting a chip or something to bring in?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you don't have to hear from me. There's a ton of work. So I mentioned.
What's worth talking about?
Well, I think I would look at Nick Bostrom's website. Nick is the guy I mentioned before, Bostrom, and Andrew Sandberg is his colleague. And they're working on the sort of criteria for what would count as an artificial brain. So that's, I think, one group that's very distinguished. The people at Cambridge also do these things. Is it inevitable? Sure, it's inevitable. But we're already doing it. I mean, Charles Peirce, an American philosopher, late 19th century, already said that my mind doesn't stop here. Right? It also extends to the ink pen that I'm using. So extensions of our thinking selves come in various forms. Sometimes I like to show my class the last half of AI, which I think is really interesting, in which Spielberg raises, I think, the really important question. What if there were no human beings, but there was still humanity? What do we value about having human beings, after all? It turns out that's a really hard question to answer. Philosophers were kicking it around in the 80s, and nobody came up with a really good response to the question. Maybe what is really worth preserving is humanity, not human beings. And it may be that ultimately non-biologically based entities are going to be the venues of humanity. Wouldn't surprise me. On the other hand, I won't be around long enough to see it.
How would you know?
How would you know? Well, that's why life extension, maybe we'll know. Not sure about the life extension theory. We have to talk about that. My mother just turned 96, and I'm not sure she's that interested in life extension at this point. Anyways, thank you so much for coming tonight. I'll be happy to chat with you.